Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is a GTX 960. Because it's the 2GB version, I was able to buy it for just under £80 including postage. In the current GPU climate, that's usually GTX 750 Ti money. Furthermore, although it's the Windforce edition, it's not the Windforce overclocked edition, meaning it shares the same speeds as the reference Nvidia model, but we do of course get the better twin fan cooler. This also contributed to the lower than usual 960 price, and although these cards haven't escaped inflated prices, they haven't been as badly affected. So what is performance like? Well, the 2 gigs of VRAM definitely limits you when it comes to adjusting certain game settings, like in Red Dead for example, but the 960, whether it's the 2 or 4GB card, is better suited to lower settings and resolutions anyway. 60 FPS is going to be too much to ask in a lot of instances unless you turn every game into a blurry mess at sub 720p, but 30 FPS plus is still very much achievable. Here in Red Dead we were seeing over 40 frames per second with sensible percentile figures as well, even in towns like Valentine. Sure, it's not the best to look at and the textures do seem a little muddy, but that doesn't take away from the enjoyment of the game. From now on, the rest of the benchmarks will be in alphabetical order, if I've managed to correctly remember the alphabet since leaving school. Watch Dogs Legion is up next. No, I'm kidding, it's Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I always test Norway because it's more demanding than England, so it's sort of a worst case scenario situation, and I tested both 1080p and 900p because I thought that 1080p would be fine first of all, but it turned out that it wasn't. 1080p will mean a lot of sub 30 FPS dips, but again, 900p seems to be the sweet spot for the card. At least you could potentially save some money on a monitor then, if you want one of these GPUs. I'm serious, I've seen a lot of sub 1080p monitors selling for next to nothing on local Facebook selling sites, so if you are on a tight budget, that may be something worth considering, especially if you have a graphics card that can't output decent frame rates at 1080p anyway. In Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, I let the game choose the settings. Most of the options defaulted to low, but even with 1080p resolution at 100% scaling, we were seeing okay performance. It wasn't quite 60 FPS at full HD, we were about 10 frames off of that, but it didn't feel too bad to be fair. As always, and here comes the line, the footage was taken from a bot match, but the figures were taken from an online game. Every map will perform differently, but my advice in Cold War is to make use of the resolution scale slider. I actually ended up going with an 85% render, as this gave us a nice balance between visual clarity and performance, meaning that we averaged over 60 FPS and didn't turn everything into a big blurry mess. That's always a bonus for online competitive play. Crysis Remastered provided us with a pretty surprising result. Even at 1080p we were getting over 60 FPS. This was with the low settings, but the game still looks great, and it seems as though the last update, the same one that added DLSS support, really helped out with performance on older hardware. This is still a great game to try if you want to benchmark some hardware. As with the settings turned way up, it's just as demanding on newer hardware as the original 2007 game was on older cards, or still is in fact. For 30 FPS in Cyberpunk 2077 then, a lower than 1080p resolution is needed, or if not you can drop the resolution scale. Native 1080p will produce 30 FPS sometimes, but the dips will make things unplayable. There will still be some drops, even with a reduced resolution, but these settings ensure a higher than 30 FPS overall average, and considering just how intensive this game is, that's a pretty good achievement with this 2GB card. Dirt 5 is more demanding than it looks, but 1080p is still doable with decent average and percentile figures. You can see that just like with pretty much every other title tested today, our VRAM is maxing out on the card, and there really isn't much room for improvement here. I do wonder about the 4GB GPU. I imagine that the averages would be similar, but the percentile figures would probably be better, so there would be less stutter and dips in games like Cyberpunk and Assassin's Creed. I guess you have to ask yourself how much is the price difference between the two where you live, and if you want a 960, Is that price difference worth the extra performance, which in some cases may even be negligible as far as the average frame rate is concerned? So there's not much to say about Fortnite. Medium settings at 1080p will be your best bet. High settings also work fine, but there are more frame dips below 60. Medium ensures that the frame rate always stays above that. Well, stays above that for most of the time anyway, so that's what I'd recommend. Or you can always use performance mode if you want closer to a constant 120 frames per second. GTA 5 is probably the oldest title I've tested today, but it's still very much relevant and it will have no problems with running at the high settings on the 2GB 960. I've kept advanced settings off as well as MSAA as I usually do because this is a huge resource hog, but judging by these figures perhaps I could have enabled it. Personally I just stick with FXAA, but it's always worth playing around with different settings to see how things change performance wise. Okay, so now it's Watch Dogs Legion, for real, this time. 85% resolution was my go-to choice for plus 30 FPS, so we're running the game at just higher than 900p. Now the actual difference probably isn't really that noticeable to the naked eye. I was quite surprised at the result here, to be honest. Watch Dogs Legion is probably one of the most demanding games to come out over the last year or so it's nice to see this once $200 sort of mid-range GPU still hanging in there, just about, even if it is by a thread in some games. Still, if you can get some enjoyment out of it, it's not obsolete, which is what I tend to say about a lot of cards. There are no bad cards, just bad prices, and owning one of these may still give you decent performance in the titles that you want to play. However, if you own one of these, then you may constantly be thinking about the 4GB version. So if you buy the 2GB card, you might find yourself wondering just how much better the 4GB card might do in any game that you fire up. You might be playing Red Dead Redemption and wondering to yourself while staring at the low, muddy textures whether or not you could have gone with medium with the 4GB GPU. But again, you have to ask yourself, is the price difference worth it where you live? With all that said then, this has been a look at the 2GB 960. We have tested, I think this probably a while ago. The last time we tested a 960 was the 4GB version, I think, which may have been last year or the year before, but I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know if you still use one of these and how it performs for you in your favourite games. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one, where we might be taking a look at the 4750G Ryzen APU. So yeah, I'm expecting some pretty impressive gaming results from that.